This is Chapter 1, Part B, on evolution, themes of biology, and scientific inquiry. Life has been evolving on Earth for billions of years, which results in the vast diversity of plant and animal species that we see today. So despite this diversity, at the same time, living things still share certain features. So the scientific explanation for this unity and diversity, how organisms are uniquely adapted and suited for their particular environments, is evolution. So evolution is just the idea that organisms that live on Earth today are modified descendants from common ancestors. So in other words, we can try to explain the traits that are shared between two organisms with the idea that they have at some point descended from a common ancestor. And we can account for these differences with the idea that those heritable changes have occurred along the way. So, a famous quote from this evolutionary biologist is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, evolution can help us explain all of the diversity that we see in the organisms today. We know that life is enormously diverse, and there is an abundance of evidence that also helps to support this occurrence of evolution. So things like the fossil record, we can also look at comparative anatomy, and also embryonic development. So modern biologists have identified approximately 1.8 million species to date. Right? Although there are estimates that the total number of species is range between 10 million to over 100 million. So one of my favorite quotes is from John Haldane, that if one could conclude as to the nature of the Creator from a study of his creation, it would appear that God has a special fondness for stars and beetles. So there are more stars than just about anything else in the universe, and there are more beetle species, insect species, than just about any other type of organism on our planet. So this figure is just showing kind of the dark blue circle is the number of species for each group that have been discovered, and then the lighter blue outside circle is kind of estimated that's yet to be discovered. So we've only discovered a very small percentage of the total diversity that exists on our planet. So, in the face of this diverse complexity, we humans are inclined to try to categorize these diverse species and organisms into smaller groups. So, taxonomy is a branch of biology that focuses on naming and classifying species kind of into a hierarchy. Right? So, we have kind of the different kingdoms. So, each species is given a unique two-part name, the genus and the species. So, you can have closely related organisms in the same genus, but every individual species will have a unique species name. So, humans, for example, our scientific name is Homo sapiens. The highest levels of classification, kind of the most broad levels of that hierarchy, are the three domains of life. So bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So all organisms, current modern known organisms, are going to fall in one of these three domains of life. So our prokaryotes are single cell, very primitive type of simple cells, things like bacteria, microscopic organisms will fall in the bacteria and archaea domains. So archaea are similar to bacteria. They're microscopic single-celled prokaryotes, but they're typically found in very extreme environments, like hydrothermal vents or sulfur ponds. So you can think of archaea as being very archaic. So they mainly survive in areas that are similar to like the ancient Earth environment, very kind of archaic or ancient type cells. And then we said eukaryotes. Eukarya are more complex cells that do have a membrane-bound nucleus to contain their genetic material. So I just like to use my tattoo for educational purposes where I can, since I'm a biology nerd. So My tattoo was inspired by this domain tree of life. So we have the three main branches. So this is our Eukarya tree. And then each branch off of the Eukarya represents some of the major kingdoms. We have plants, animals, fungi, some of the protists. So for animals, I have a Darwin finch. So Charles Darwin, we'll talk about, studied finches when he came up with his theory of natural selection and evolution. But the thing that's going to connect all of these branches and all life on Earth is DNA. If we go back far enough with our DNA, we can trace back to a single common ancestor from which all modern life arose. So the domain Eukarya includes all the eukaryotic organisms, so the more complex cells that do contain a true nucleus. So the four subgroups, or say kingdoms, in the Eukarya domain include plants. So plants are classified, or these kingdoms are basically classified based on their modes of nutrition. So how do they get or obtain and use their energy? So plants are able to produce their own food from photosynthesis. So we said they harvest the energy from the sunlight to generate their own food. Fungi are kind of like decomposers, so they decompose dead organisms and organic waste and absorb nutrients from those sources. So they absorb dissolved nutrients from the surroundings and help recycle those nutrients. Animals have to obtain and ingest food by ingesting other organisms. So animals eat other plants or other animals. And then the fourth kingdom group are protists. So protists are single-celled, very numerous and much more diverse than the other kingdoms. So protists are the most numerous and diverse of all the eukaryotes. So where plants, fungi, animals kind of have their own functions, their own lanes they stay in, protists can kind of dip into all of the different types of kingdoms. So they're mostly single-celled organisms classified into several various groups. So you could have some protists that are very similar to plants, more closely related to plants. So like this protist, single-celled protist, Euglena, it is capable of undergoing photosynthesis. So it has chloroplasts, so similar to plants, but it's not a plant. We also have some animal-like protists, so like a paramecium or an amoeba, things, single-celled organisms that ingest and eat other organisms. We have some fungi-like protists that can grow kind of in, have those hyphae or those septa structure. And we have like algae, so algae are considered protists, right? So they're photosynthetic single-celled organisms. So very vast diversity in the protist group. So underlying all of this diversity in life is a striking unity, especially when we look at the molecular and cellular levels of organization. The universal genetic language common to all organisms is DNA. So prokaryotes and eukaryotes all are going to rely on those genetic instructions in the DNA. And among eukaryotes, the unity is going to be presented in minute details of cellular structure and some molecular structure. And we can also look at more microscopic features like the skeletal similarities of different animals. So the forelimbs or the arms of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. So we're all mammals. So even though their forelimbs have different functions, right, and structures, we still have the same basic kind of body plan and bone arrangement. So we all have a humerus, right, an upper arm, we have two forearm bones, then we have the wrist bones, the carpals, but throughout evolution, they've just been kind of molded to suit different functions. But this is going to kind of tell us that at some point way back, we do share a common mammal ancestor. So this is always a cool example of this kind of similarity in bone structure of mammals. So this is a cross-section of an elephant's foot. So looking at an elephant's foot from the outside, you can't really, you wouldn't really think that the bone structure is this way, right? But just looking at the arrangement and the shape of the bones, it looks very similar to our own human foot bone structure because we share a mammal ancestor way, way back. So even at the small cellular level, so a protist, a paramecium, has cilia, right? Cilia are just little hairs that kind of sweep water and fluid around the cell. So also in our respiratory tract, we have cilia. We have these little hairs that line our respiratory tract to help sweep mucus up and out of our respiratory system. So at the microscopic molecular level, the structure of the cilia between the protist and our own respiratory cells is the same structure. So the genetic code, the instructions on how to make one of these cilia is going to be the same because we share that ancestry. Another point of evidence that supports evolution is embryology. So the very early developing stages of an embryo after fertilization. So those very early genetic instructions on how to make an organism are going to be the same because we have that shared ancestry. So when you look at the embryo of different organisms, from a fish to a turtle, a salamander, or even a human, they're almost indistinguishable because, like I said, those very early programming instructions are going to be the same. The history of life is also documented by fossils. So we have fossil evidence to help support this idea of evolution. So we can go back in time, the deeper we go, and see this natural progression of organisms and their similarities to modern organisms over the changing of the earth over millions or billions of years. So Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution by natural selection. So he published The Origin of the Species in 1859, which, if you think about it, back then this was a pretty radical idea that species were not fixed and created all at one time, like in Genesis, as people had believed up to that point. So that species were constantly changing and evolution was occurring. So during his studies, he studied finches in the Galapagos Islands and just noticed their different beak structures. Using his observations, he made two main points. One was that species showed evidence of a descent with modification from common ancestors, meaning that they had similarities to the ancestors, but they had been modified along the way. So they're similar, but they're different in their own way. So natural selection is the mechanism kind of behind this descent with modification. So Darwin's theory helped to explain the duality of the unity and diversity that we see. So unity in the kinship among the species that descended from the common ancestors, but diversity in their modifications that evolved as they branched away from the common ancestors. So this was one of his earlier sketches, kind of one of the first phylogenetic trees that he came up with, showing kind of this descent with modification where we had the original species, say, on the main island, the mainland, and as that original species descendants moved out to these little satellite islands, they became more specialized to the food sources, different food sources on these smaller islands, and evolution, natural selection, kind of molded the new species that branched off from there. So he was studying primarily their beak shape. So beak shape, again, going back to structure reflects function, the shape of their beak is going to be fine-tuned to their diet. So the finches that eat seeds from cacti, right, the cactus finch would have a more long pointed beak. Right? Whereas the insect-eating finch, the warbler finch, has a more thin, sharper kind of spear beak to grab insects with. And then the large ground finch has a wider, heavier, shorter beak to crack open seeds that it finds on the ground. So Darwin started with 3 observations from nature when studying these finches. One is that individuals in a population will vary in their traits. Right? They have many heritable traits that can vary. So there is diversity within a population. He also noticed that the population can potentially produce far more offspring than the environment can support. So there's going to be some competition for resources. Right? So there's not going to be enough food or mates or water or habitat for all of the individuals in the population. So they're going to have to kind of fight over and compete for those resources. And then the third observation was that species generally are suited to or adapted to their environments. So, based on these observations, Darwin reasoned that individuals with the inherited traits that are better suited for their environment are going to produce more healthy, fertile offspring, right? So, the better you are at surviving, the more likely you are to reproduce, right? And then your offspring will have those same favorable traits because they're inherited through the DNA. So, then over many generations over time, these heritable traits that enhance the survival and reproductive success will increase among a population. So more individuals in the population will have these beneficial traits. So evolution occurs over time at the population level as the unequal reproductive success of individuals that leads to their adaptation in an environment. So evolution and natural selection doesn't necessarily affect one individual in the population, but it affects the population as a whole over time as those traits and those genes are going to shift. So the natural environment is going to select for the propagation of those beneficial traits. Right? And this is what we now call or know as natural selection. So some examples of natural selection. One classic example is the long neck of the giraffe. The theory is that giraffes that have longer necks can more easily reach the leaves at the top of the tree. So if their neck isn't long enough, they're not going to be able to reach those leaves. They're not going to be able to get enough food. They're not going to be able to produce as many offspring. So eventually the shorter neck giraffes will die off, and the genes for longer necks will persist in the population until all of the individuals have that long neck trait. Another example is we can look at with beetle color. So these birds love to eat the green beetles, right, in the population. So there's variation in the trait. So we have some green beetles, we have some red or brown beetles. The birds like to eat the green ones. So the green ones are not going to survive as well because they're going to keep getting picked off by the birds. So they're not going to have a chance to reproduce and pass on their green color genes to the next generation. So over time, the brown beetles are going to be able to produce more offspring. So the genes for brown color is going to become more prevalent in the population until eventually the green beetles have been selected against and the brown beetles have flourished and taken over. So this population as a whole has evolved from green to brown. The unity of mammalian limb anatomy is one classic example of um, inheritance from that structure from a common ancestor. So, kind of the prototype mammal from which all other mammals descended. So, we talked about kind of the basic bone structure. So, they can have different functions and overall shapes, right? But we have that same base bone structure with the humerus, right? The radius ulna in the forearm, the carpals, the wrist bones, and the phalanges. Okay, but natural selection over time, since we've branched off from that original common ancestor, has then molded that bone structure further to reflect different functions for these species' different environments. The fossils and other evidence can help corroborate this anatomical unity of this descent with modification. So this example, we can look at the fossil record and trace back the evolution of modern horses. Right? So here's our modern horse skeleton in the skull. So if we go back and look at the fossil record, we can see kind of this gradual change, this gradual modification over many, many years and generations that ultimately led to our modern horse. So natural selection by kind of cumulative effects over many, many years, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, can produce new species from ancestral species. So a lot of times this happens when a population becomes fragmented or isolated in different environments. So then they may gradually have to diversify into different species as each population is going to adapt over many generations to those different environmental problems. So the environment is always changing and species have to adapt to those changes if they're going to survive. Um, so going back to Darwin's research with the finches, right? So we had a common ancestor from the mainland, and then some of those offspring ventured out to new islands. So these islands all had different environments, different food sources. So the finches had to evolve and adapt to those new environments. So it's reflected now in their different beak shapes. So we can now use anatomical and geographic data, biogeography, and more recently DNA to kind of sort out these evolutionary relationships among different species. So we can arrange this kind of family tree called a phylogenetic tree to show the relationship between different organisms and kind of how closely or distantly related they are. So basically, the closer their branches are on the tree, the more closely related they are, the more recent their divergence. So the medium tree finch and the large tree finch shared a most recent common ancestor, so at this branch point. Okay, so the medium ground finch is going to be more closely related to the large ground finch. So the small tree finch is also related, but it branched off a bit further back on the tree. So which finch is most closely related to the green warbler finch? Right, so that would be the gray warbler. So they're sharing kind of that same branch point there. So these are referred to as sister taxa. So they're closest on the tree. They come from that same branching point. So we can trace back evolutionary history all the way back. If we go back far enough, right, all living organisms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, right, we can trace back to a single common ancestor. So all of life is connected through DNA and throughout a very long evolutionary history. So now shifting gears and kind of just looking at science in general. What is science? How do we do science? So the word science is derived from Latin, meaning just to know. Science is a way of knowing, so how we understand the natural world around us. And at the heart of science is inquiry, right? So basically asking questions and focusing on specific questions that we can answer. So we try to come up with explanations for the natural phenomena that we see around us. So as scientists, biologists attempt to understand how the natural phenomena work using a process of inquiry that includes making observations, forming a logical hypothesis, or kind of an educated explanation, and then testing those hypotheses. So in doing science or biology, looking at exploration and observation, it's always going to begin with just a careful observation and analysis of data. So these observations can be valuable in their own right and reveal, important information about the natural world. For example, there's a series of detailed observations that have built up our understanding of cellular structure that we're constantly and still expanding our databases of genomes of diverse species. So science is always going to kind of build on the foundation of existing knowledge. So we're kind of standing on the backs of giants and just continuing to dive deeper into this inquiry. So we rely heavily on published contributions of fellow scientists, but modern times, thankfully, it's much more easy to find relevant publications and past research thanks to electronic databases. So when we record our observations, we call this data or data, however you want to pronounce it. There's two main types of data. So qualitative data is where we're just describing kind of the quality of something. So we're dealing with descriptions, things that can be observed but not really measured. So texture, smell, taste, appearance. Okay? Whereas quantitative data, now we are measuring quantities of something. So this is something that can actually be measured, and we're dealing with numbers. Right? So length, height, volume, temperature, time, speed, etc. So in this example, we have an oil painting, right, that we are observing. So the qualitative data for the painting, right, would be some of its kind of just physical qualities. So the colors, the frame, maybe it smells old and musty, the texture, if you can see the texture of the brush strokes, kind of what it's a painting of, a peaceful scene. Whereas the quantitative data, the numerical kind of hard measured data, now we're looking at the dimensions of the painting, the width of the frame, the weight of the painting as a whole, the surface area, how much it costs. Qualitative is the quality, quantitative is the quantity. So through induction, scientists can derive generalizations based on large numbers of specific observations. So we use careful observation and data analysis, and then we can kind of use induction to generalize an understanding of the nature of the question that we're looking at. So inductive reasoning, we're just kind of looking at general principles from specific observations. So an example would be if all organisms are made of cells, okay, based on years of findings from biologists. So biologists over the years have looked at all different types of organisms and tissues, and they notice a pattern is that they're all based on cells. So that's how we came up with cell theory, right? So using inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is kind of going backwards. So now we're looking at general concepts to make more specific predictions. So the initial observations with deductive reasoning could give rise to multiple hypotheses. So instead of going from specific observations to general conclusions, we're going from general observations to specific conclusions. So in this example, if all organisms are made of cells and humans are organisms, then thereby humans are also made of cells. So part of the scientific method of inquiry is forming a hypothesis and testing that hypothesis. So in science, a hypothesis is just kind of an educated explanation based on our observations, research, assumptions that lead to a testable prediction. So initial observations may give rise to multiple hypotheses. So there may be more than one possible answer to our question. But it has to lead to a prediction that can be tested by making additional observations or doing experiments. So in this example, our desk lamp doesn't work, right? So that's our observation. The lamp doesn't work. So our question is why? Why doesn't the lamp work? So again, it could give rise to multiple hypotheses. So it could be hypothesis one, the lamp doesn't work because the bulb is burnt out. Or hypothesis two, the lamp doesn't work because the bulb is improperly screwed in. Right? These are things that we can test. These are viable hypotheses. A hypothesis that ghosts came in and fooled with the desk lamp, we can't test that. So that's not a viable prediction or hypothesis. So then we can use an experiment, which is just a scientific test under controlled conditions to test the hypothesis to see if our results support our prediction or hypothesis or not. So both of these are testable. So the experiment then would be to replace the bulb. Okay, so if the lamp then works after we replace the bulb, right, then the hypothesis is supported, right, by our results. If we test this one, we can just try to reinstall the bulb. So maybe tighten it a little bit if it's not screwed in all the way, but the lamp still doesn't work. So this hypothesis is not supported. So we would go back to the drawing board and maybe test a different hypothesis. The scientific method is just kind of an idealized process of inquiry. So it doesn't have to adhere very rigidly to this approach. You can backtrack partway through the process, maybe you need to go back and change your test, your experiment, or adjust your hypothesis, or do some extra research or observations. In some cases, observations may just be too puzzling to make an educated hypothesis or a well-defined guess or question. So you have to go back and do more research. So this example, using the scientific method just in your everyday life, to say your car won't start, right? So that's our observation. So we ask a question, why won't the car start? So there's multiple possibilities. We can come up with multiple hypotheses, but we'll start with maybe the tank is empty, right? So the car won't start because the tank is empty. That's our hypothesis. So then we make a prediction before we do our experiment. So if I fill the tank, then the car should start. So a lot of times these hypotheses will take kind of an if and then format. So if I do this, then this will happen. So if I fill the tank, then the car should start. So our experiment would be to fill the gas tank. So we put some gas in the car and see if the car starts, right? So if the car then starts, then our hypothesis is supported. If it doesn't start, so that didn't work, so then we have to go back and formulate a new hypothesis and start over again. So maybe it's something else, right? So maybe the battery's dead. So then if I charge the battery, or if I jump off the car, then the car should start. Right? So to test that, we would hook up the battery cables, right? Try to give it a jump start and see if that works. Okay. So like I said, it could be something, so maybe it's something kind of outside of our scope. Could be something more complex than just adding gas to the car or jumping it off. Maybe it's something to do, maybe the generator is bad or the alternator. Maybe the starter's bad, right? Maybe the distributor's off or spark plug's bad. So this would probably require a little bit more research, or maybe you would consult with an expert, so a mechanic, then at this point to kind of decipher this to make a better educated hypothesis, right, to be able to test it. So one case study given in your book about the process of scientific inquiry is investigating different coat colorations in mouse populations. So we said that individuals in a population can vary, right? And those variable traits are heritable, so they can be passed on from parent to offspring. So color patterns of animals can vary widely in nature, even between members of the same species. So we looked at two populations of mice in the same species, but they have different color patterns because they live in different environments. So the beach mouse has a lighter coat color, right, because it lives on the light colored sand near the beach. The inland mouse lives right in the vegetation and the brush area, so it has a darker coat. So the two types of mice match the coloration of their habitats. So because mice are common prey items for predators such as owls, so these natural predators are visual hunters. So they're going to rely on being able to see those mice in the environment to catch them. They theorized that the color patterns of the different mice populations had evolved as adaptations to help protect the mice from predators, right? So think back to the green and brown beetle analogy, right? A group of students decided to test this hypothesis. So the hypothesis is basically that mice have different coat colors to protect them from predators. Right? So the researchers predicted that mice that did not match their habitat would be preyed on more heavily than mice that did blend in and match the surroundings. So to test this hypothesis, they designed an experiment where they had mice models, and they painted them to match the surrounding and placed equal numbers of each type of model in the habitat. And then they monitored and recorded signs of predation. So how many of these models were attacked by the predators? So their data supported the hypothesis of the camouflage being an adaptive trait of the mice. So in the beach habitat, so they put out 100 dark painted mice on the beach and light painted mice on the beach. Right? So experiments, we usually always have a control group. So this is kind of what already is there. Like if we just do nothing, what naturally happens, right? So naturally on the beach, you would have the lighter colored mice. So our experimental group would be the darker coated mice, right? So same thing with the inland habitat. We had light colored models against the brown habitat, and our natural control group for the dark furred models. So what they found was a higher percentage of the dark mice were attacked in the beach habitat, and a higher percentage of the white mice were attacked in the inland habitat because they're not camouflaged for the environment anymore. It's easier for those predators to find those mice and try to eat them. So this controlled experiment, like I said, we had an experimental group, the non-camouflaged mice, with the control group. So the control group is kind of what's already there, the camouflaged mice. Right. So with natural selection over time at the beach habitat, the darker mice would be preyed upon more often, so they're not going to pass on their dark fur genes, and then over time, the gene for white fur is going to predominate. So in experiments, the variables are just things that can vary in an experiment, so things that we can change or manipulate. So you always want to have your constants. So we want to keep the same number of mice. So say we had 100 white mice, then we also need 100 dark mice, right? So we need to keep everything controlled and equal. But the variable, the thing that we changed, the one thing we changed was the coat color of the mice. So there's generally two types of variables in an experiment. So the independent variable, this is what we are manipulating. So being manipulated by the researchers. So coat color. So we changed the coat color, right, from white to dark or from dark to white. The dependent variable is going to be the result, right? So it's predicted to be affected in response to what we changed, okay? So in this example, the independent variable is the mouse color. The dependent variable is how many mice were attacked by predators, right? So how many mice get attacked by predators is going to depend on their coat color. Another example, independent variable, that's what we're changing. So in this experiment, we're giving these plants different amounts of water, right? So that's our independent variable. The dependent variable is the result of this change. So the size of the plant, the number of leaves, right, is going to depend on how much water those plants received. So we talk about theories in science. So in the context of science, a scientific theory is a bit broader in scope than a hypothesis, but it is general enough that we can lead to many new testable hypotheses from this theory. But in order to be considered a theory, it has to be supported by a large body of evidence in comparison to just a singular hypothesis. So like when people say evolution is just a theory, well, theory and common language usually just means, oh, it's just a guess. But a theory in science means that we have a large body of evidence to support this theory, and we don't really have anything that contradicts it. So based on careful, reasonable examination of facts, tested and confirmed again and again to explain and predict natural phenomenon. So we have to have repeated results, and like I said, nothing that really contradicts those results. So science as a whole is going to benefit from a cooperative approach and diverse viewpoints. So most scientists work in teams, which can include graduate students or undergraduate students or colleagues and other researchers. So it's important to have good communication so we're able to share our research results either through seminars, publications in journals, and websites. So with science, the research papers are not published, right, and put out there as verified science until they have passed the peer review process. So it's not like where scientists can just post their results on a website or social media and it's taken, as fact. So there is a rigorous process to kind of getting your science out there through this peer review process. So A scientist will study something, they write about their results, they send it to an editor of a journal to review, and then the editor sends it out to different peers, so to other scientists in that field that would be knowledgeable of that work. So they review the article, they can provide feedback. Some of the scientists may try to repeat the experiment to see if they get the same results. And then the editor can send back the comments for the original scientist to revise and resubmit an article. So if it doesn't maintain sufficiently high scientific standards, it could be rejected and never published at all. If it does meet those high standards of the journal and the publication, then it can be published in a journal and dispensed to other scientists or students. When we look at science, there's difference between, just Googling something. Someone says they do their research, so YouTube and TikTok and Google are not research, not viable scientific research. So only research that has been vetted and passed through this peer review process can be considered legitimate scientific research that we can refer to. So we said science is always building on the works of others. So scientists can check each other's claims by performing similar experiments. So just because you have some research published, if other scientists cannot repeat your experiment, if they can't do the same type of experiment and get similar results, then they can refute the claims that you made in your original research, right? So your original claim would have to be revised. So it's not unusual or uncommon for different scientists or groups of scientists to work on the same research question at the same time, right, to see if they come up with the same results. Right, so science experiments have to be repeatable and results have to be reproducible. So we have to be able to perform the same experiment and reproduce those results to confirm that data or that research. So science, technology, and society are all intertwined and interlinked. So science is going to build on the work of previous studies. We said we're kind of building on the work of previous scientists and just continuing to dive further into those questions. So the combination of science and technology can have dramatic effects on society. So example, the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick back in the 1950s, right, has opened a ton of doors and advances in DNA technology. So now we have DNA testing for hereditary diseases, right? We have genome researches, we have bioengineering, right? We have GMOs, but it all is based and built on the backs of the work by those previous scientists and their research. So without that knowledge of DNA structure and how it functions, we wouldn't be able to accomplish this further, more advanced research that we have today. So with biotechnology, pretty much Pandora's box has already been opened. So there's no going back. There's no unknowing what we now know about our DNA and our genetic the possibilities, right, with this technology. So now more modern debates center more on should we do it rather than can we do it. So these ethical issues that can arise from new technology can involve as much to do with politics, economics, cultural values, as it does just science and technology, which is at the heart of these processes. So one thing to think about, a common kind of ethical issue with biotechnology is designer babies. So we have the capability, right? It is possible with our biotechnology that we can kind of select specific genes for embryos and babies to maybe have a higher IQ. We could potentially eradicate a lot of genetic diseases and cancers and things. So we could give this baby no inherited diseases, more athletic skills, a high IQ, perfect vision, low risk of some other disorders, right? But just because we can do it, should we do it? Is that ethical? It just depends kind of, I guess, who you ask or what the context is. So I always recommend this movie, Gattaca, if you get a chance to watch it. It used to be on Netflix. It kind of explores this idea of this kind of genetic engineering of humans, these designer babies. So in the future, they do this, and it leads to kind of a separate class system. So the higher class people in society have been genetically engineered. They have all of these desirable genetic traits, whereas the normal people that just kind of get the roll of the dice, the genetic dice, are considered low class people. So it's a pretty interesting movie if you get a chance to watch it. Right, some interesting things to think about with biotechnology in the future going forward.